Welcome everyone. We're really delighted to have James Hunt presenting today. James is an agronomist, a crop physiologist who specialises in water-limited productivity of dryland cropping and mixed farming systems. His research really focuses on using combinations of management and genetics to increase the productivity and profitability of grain-based farming systems. And previously, James worked at Latrobe and at Ciro for 7 years. And prior to that, also worked at Birchip Cropping Group for 5 years. He's received a number of awards for research excellence over the years, and the outcomes from his research have been widely adopted by grain growers across southern Australia, or at least southeastern parts of Australia. So thank you very much, James, for delivering your seminar today. We really look forward to it.
Thanks very much, Robin, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for coming. And as a reasonably new starter at the University of Melbourne, I just wanted to thank everyone for the warm welcome I've received since I've got here, and I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into some research and teaching now that I'm here. And this is a good opportunity for me to, I guess, describe to people in the faculty the sort of research that I do and the things that I'm interested in. And one of the things that I'm really interested in and get inordinately excited about is wheat and wheat yield in the world and in Australia, and that's going to be the subject of my talk today. I've tried to keep it reasonably general, but I've inserted a bit of agronomy in there, so I hope you can all hang in there and bear with me. So in order to try and keep things general and improve understanding, I'm going to start with a slide explaining exactly what agronomy is, because when I tell people that I'm a professor in agronomy, the number one response I get back is, what actually is agronomy? And probably the best way of explaining it is that it's like a GP for farming systems, a general practitioner. So we use knowledge and understanding that are derived from science, so we are scientists, to improve the functioning of farming systems, so to increase yield or productivity, profit, and sustainability are kind of the big things we aim to do, but we largely do this through changing management rather than improving genetics. So we're generalists. We don't tend to specialise. We have broad, shallow knowledge, and we need to work with lots of discipline specialists to achieve what we want to achieve. And this is a kind of pictorial representation of how I reckon agronomy works when it's at its best. And yeah, really we sit here as generalists or sort of integrators of things into farming systems. So agronomists tend to have a good shallow knowledge of farming systems and all the things that make up farming systems, but not deep specialist knowledge. But we can frame research questions and identify and define constraints, and then define solutions and opportunities to overcome those. And that's where we really need input from discipline specialists, which are most people that sit in universities and the like, test those and then integrate them back into farming systems. And if you're sort of interested in the role I see for agronomy playing in the current research landscape, there's a book chapter here that I wrote a couple of years ago with some colleagues that outlines that. Okay, so that's the introduction to agronomy over. Let's get into wheat, and I'll start this talk as an honours student would start the introduction for their thesis, and just provide some fun facts about wheat and in a global context. So we'll start off big and global, and then focus down and get very local. So wheat obviously is one of the three big staple grains, along with rice and maize, and those three grains pretty much equally contribute to calories calorie consumption of humans in the world, and they each provide about 20% or thereabouts of calories consumed by humans, both directly, but also indirectly through animal feed. So most people in Western countries eat wheat directly or indirectly every day. When I say indirectly, if you've eaten eggs this morning, the chickens were probably fed wheat to produce those eggs. If you've had dairy products, the cows were probably fed wheat to produce those products. So you're probably only not regularly consuming wheat or something derived from it if you're gluten-free vegan. And it's an important source of protein, particularly in developing parts of the world. There's two main species. So bread wheat is the common one, and durum wheat is less common, but they tend to be bundled together when you're talking about production. They're agronomically pretty similar, and it's by far the most widely adapted staple crop in the world. It's grown from the tropics, pretty close to the equator, all the way up to some pretty high latitudes. So this map here shows regional output, and you can see there's a few blobs of green close to the equator in Africa, in Ethiopia and Kenya, where it's grown at high altitude to escape the tropical heat. But the real bread baskets of the world are in the high latitude and continental environments. So China, North China is a real powerhouse, the Indo-Gangetic Plain, Europe, and the Great Plains of North America, and of course, Australia. And the thing that really gives wheat its broad adaptation is the ability for humans to manipulate its life cycle. And we're going to talk a bit more about that later on, the duration of its life cycle. And something I want to point out on this map before we move on is that this area of the world here, so what's known as West Asia, North Africa, or WANA, these countries consume quite a lot of wheat, but they are not very food secure, so they don't produce that much. They're heavily reliant on imports of wheat, and most of those imports currently come out of the Black Sea region and Ukraine. So that's global wheat production. How does Australia sit in that global context? Australia grows quite a lot of wheat, but not as much as many other countries in the world. So it's in the top 10 producers, but it grows nowhere near as much as China, which, as I say, is a real powerhouse. India, if you look at the EU combined, it's a pretty big mega producer, but Australia sits around about the same level of production as Pakistan, Ukraine, Germany, in terms of the megatons produced. But the interesting thing about Australia, which it shares with Ukraine, is that whilst it only represents about 4% of global production, it accounts for about 10% of global exports. So the majority of Australian wheat is exported. So domestic demand's only about 7 million tonnes. So the rest goes overseas, and that contributes to maintaining excuse me, a steady global price. So it's important for food security, that supply into the global market, just like Ukraine is, which accounts for 11% of the world's exports, I think. So when things happen to Ukraine and Australia's wheat production, the food price goes up and things start to get a bit scary, which is something that's going to be unfolding in the next few months. Okay, so that number that I put up in the previous slide for wheat production was an average over the last 20 years. But the other key feature of Australia's wheat production is that it's extremely variable from year to year. And this is driven by climate variability, largely rainfall variability. So in wet years, La Nina years, where there's a lot of rainfall and a cool spring, Australia can produce a lot of wheat, close to 35 million tonnes. In an El Nino season, which is very dry and we have a hot spring, it's closer to 10 million tonnes, so huge variation in what we produce, because Australia is one of the most variable climates in the world, and not many other countries have that level of massive variation. So that's quite a feature. Now, why do we care about Australian wheat yield in a global context? In my mind, it really relates to what I was talking about before, and its role as an export provider of wheat, and keeping that global wheat price affordable for the least or the most disadvantaged populations of the world. So the way the sort of international food system works is that it's all supply and demand driven. If supply is able to keep up with demand, prices stay low, everyone can afford staple food. But if supplies start to tighten, as would happen if Australia went into drought or Ukraine was invaded by Russia, for instance, then you start to get spikes in the food price, which this graph shows here. And typically they're associated with civil unrest in countries that are reliant on wheat imports and might not have a lot of purchasing power, where the population might not have a lot of purchasing power. So that was really stark in the 2007 and 2008 increase in the wheat price, which was partly driven by Australia having a couple of years of drought, and a lot of the protests in the at that time were really related. Obviously, there was other issues beyond food security, but this protester from Yemen taping some bread to his head is meant to indicate that a lot of the unhappiness was to do with the price of bread. So it's important to keep Australia's wheat productive and supplying that wheat to the rest of the world to keep the price down, so everyone in the world can afford to eat. That's the kind of global context. If we focus in on Australia itself, wheat is the dominant dryland crop in Australia. It's a major form of land use within the 300 to 600 millimetre annual rainfall isohyets, and sort of inland of the Great Dividing Range, and it kind of runs down the east coast from Queensland through Victoria and South Australia, and of course Western Australia is the state that generally produces the most wheat. Sometimes New South Wales gives it a run for its money. Wheat's not grown by itself on crop farms. It's grown in rotation, mostly with other crops these days, but it is dominant. So wheat typically accounts for about 50% of crop area, but it's grown in rotation with barley, in broadleaf break crops, canola, and a bunch of different pulses, which are sort of grown in different amounts in different parts of Australia. But an interesting feature of Australia's climate and its seasonality is that all these crops are grown over winter, and they rely on the autumn break, so the first significant rain of autumn, for establishment to germinate the seed and allow it to emerge. And this makes Australia's seasonality relatively unusual in the world, in a global context. So it's a Levantine or a Mediterranean seasonality, where wheat, and Australia is quite unusual in that it grows spring wheat mostly during winter. So it's sown in autumn, typically the end of April, start of May, grows through a relatively mild winter, flowers in spring, and it's harvested in summer. And most regions, wheat producing regions of the world, so China, North America, Europe, have much harder winters, harsher winters, and winter wheat is mostly sort of sown in autumn and overwinters, and spring wheat, which is where it gets its name from, is sown in spring to avoid that harsh winter and winter kill, which spring wheat can't tolerate. So Australia is a bit weird in that it sows spring wheat in autumn, and we do grow a little bit of winter wheat, which I'll talk about more, but it's effectively treated like spring wheat and just has a more stable flowering time. So this is what a lot of wheat fields around southern Australia are looking like right now, being sown at the end of April, start of May. Perfect autumn break this season for a lot of the wheat belt. Nice timely rainfall allowed for timely establishment, which is really important for yield. Those crops will grow through winter, look something like this. This is after flowering and during grain fill in October. And most of the wheat belt likes to be finished harvest before Christmas, which is a nice aspirational target, but some of the cooler environments go a bit later. Now, most of Australia's wheat is exported, but it's mostly exported to Southeast Asia. So we're not sort of directly addressing necessarily that sort of food insecurity in North Africa and West Asia so much, but by supplying that to the global market, we keep the price down. So most of Australia's wheat, or a lot of Australia's wheat, isn't used for bread. It ends up in noodles in Southeast Asia. Okay, that's a little bit of introduction to wheat and Australian wheat production. Now we're going to focus on yield, which is what we need to maintain production and to keep global price affordable. And we're going to spend a bit of time at looking at past successes in Australian wheat yield over the decades. So this graph here shows historic wheat production since from 1850 to 2009, so a bit over 50 years since European invasion, up until when this paper was published in 2010. And what myself and John Kierkegaard put on this graph here is we tried to highlight the management, which sits up the top, and the genetic innovations which have delivered yield increases over that period. And our sort of philosophy was, or generally health philosophy, is that yield is a function of genotype, so what cultivar you grow, management, so how you manage it, when you sow it, when you fertilise it, how much you fertilise, and environment, so how much rain, temperature, etc. And what we were asserting in this paper is that past rapid yield increases have been due to combinations of management and genetics coming together to form new sort of coherent farming systems that have synergies with each other. We can sort of look at some examples here. So this sort of period of yield decline from European colonisation up until 1900 was Australia's earliest experiment with organic farming. So we're just seeing a period of nutrient decline. So the native fertility Australia soils being mined and exploited and not being topped up with fertilisers or manures. So in 1900, there was a few innovations that hit the ground. One of those was Federation wheat, which I'll talk about a bit later. The other one was superphosphate, so high analysis phosphorus fertiliser to replace what had been removed. And the other one was fallowing, which is essentially the practice of only growing a crop every second year. So you're mineralising nitrogen out of the soil, and you're accumulating soil water to allow growth. So that gave a real kick to the yield. Next one was largely a management intervention, and that was improved legume pastures, so subclover and medics in various parts around the cropping belt, grown in rotation with crops, so back when Australia rode on the sheep's back, and that really alleviated nitrogen deficiency in Australian crops, and you got another kick up. The next one was this recent one, which I'm going to dive into a bit more, but sort of from the 80s and 90s onward, where you had this sort of real package of semi-dwarf wheats coming out of the green revolution, and a bunch of new crop inputs, so herbicides, nitrogen fertiliser, as well as herbicides allowed no-till farming, so no cultivation, and that allowed early sowing. And we also had a lot of public investment delivering broadleaf break crops to be grown in rotation with wheat. And then we have this last little period here, which is the millennium drought period, where we had a sustained decline or stagnation in wheat yield, which I'm going to talk a bit more about now. But before I do that, we're going back to agronomy school again, and we're going to talk about yield concepts, because they're important for the data that I'm about to show you. So agronomists conceptualize yields in order to benchmark performance and see to what extent farmers are achieving, if they're achieving the yields that the environment allows. And, I use the definitions provided by University of Melbourne notable agricultural alumnus, Tony Fisher. And the concepts are as follows. So farm yield is what we call the yield that's achieved by farmers in their fields. And then at the other extreme of that is what we call potential yield, which Fisher defines as the measured yield of the best cultivar grown with optimal agronomy and without any manageable stress of any description, so perfectly managed. So this is largely set by the ratio of temperature and radiation in a given environment. But in rain-fed environments, like Australia, a more useful concept is water-limited potential yield, which is the same as potential yield, but there's no other manageable limitation to the crop apart from the water supply. So it's the best you could possibly do, the best yield you could possibly do for the resources that you have. Then to keep Bill happy, we have what's called economic yield. So that's the yield attained by farmers, sort of taking into account the decreasing law of returns and risk of production. And the difference between farm yield and water limited potential yield is what we call the yield gap, or the way I'm about to present it to you is what's called relative yield. So that's farm yield expressed as a percentage of water limited potential yield. So what percentage of the possible yield that could be grown are farmers achieving? So this is kind of a schematic illustration of those concepts for those with a more visual learning style. So we have potential yield up here set by the prevailing radiation and temperature of the target environment. We have water limited potential yield down here, which is lower in dryland environments usually. And then we bring in the human element. So this is the yield that can be achieved for a given investment in input. So this is an efficiency frontier. And where different farmers sit on this frontier is determined by how much they invest in inputs like fertilizer and fungicides, and their skill in farming, so how timely they are largely. And down here somewhere we have economic yield, which reflects the law of decreasing returns. So this is a farmer one, and they sit down on the curve a fair bit away from economic yield or water limited potential yield because they're not investing a lot in inputs, but they have a high management skill. They're up on that efficiency frontier. Farmer 2 is in the sweet spot. They're investing appropriately in inputs and they have a high level of management skill. They're up on the frontier. Farmer 3 is probably over-investing in inputs. The additional inputs between Farmer 2 and Farmer 3 probably aren't receiving a profitable return, but they do have a high level of management skill. Farmer 4 is down here and investing the same inputs as Farmer 2, but not achieving the same yield because they don't have the same management skill. So they've got a yield gap. So the difference between their yield and economic yield is called the exploitable yield gap. The difference between their yield and water limited potential yield is called the yield gap. Okay. So these graphs come from what I reckon is the most important paper published on Australian agriculture, certainly this century and possibly last as well, which was published in 2017 by some of my former colleagues from CSIRO, led by Hochman. and it looked at Australian wheat production since 1900 and what had happened since 1990. And this relates to that sort of decline around the millennium drought that I talked about before. But what they showed, this is farm yield, by the way, so actual yield achieved by farmers in Australia. What they showed is that from the period 1900 to 1990, there'd been steady progress, increase in yield. But from 1990 onward, that had stagnated. So the regression line that they fitted was not significant. So it's essentially flat. So there'd been no increase in yield nationally from 1990 up to 2014 or 15. Sorry, I think they did it up to. Then they went and had a look at what might have been driving this, because there was a lot of theories about what this could be due to. Was it due to declining investment in ag R&D? Was it due to climate change? Was it due to change practices, etc.? And what they did is they used a crop simulation model to calculate water limited potential yield for the grain belt. And what they showed is that water limited potential yield had actually declined over that period. So the amount of yield that growers could possibly grow if they did everything right had actually reduced. So the ceiling had come down. Then they unpacked that. Well, then they looked at relative yield. So what were farmers achieving in terms of the water limited potential yield that was on offer? And they showed that they'd actually increased their relative yield, so the percentage of water limited potential yield, at an unprecedentedly rapid rate. So even though actual yields, farm yields were declining, relative yield, so how efficient farmers were being, were increasing at a rapidly, the most rapid rate, but it was essentially being eroded by this decline in water limited potential yield, which, not surprisingly, was due to a decline in in-crop rainfall, or primarily due to a decline in in-crop rainfall. So the water supply during that period had declined, and consequently there was a commensurate decline in water limited potential yield, but farmers were doing the best job they ever had of making use of that limited resources. There was also an effect of temperature, so yeah, direct consequence of global warming. So summarising all of that, there'd been a decline over that period from 1990, a 27% decline in water limited potential yield, and most of that was due to a decline in rainfall over that period, and 83% was due to that, and 17% was due to increasing temperatures, which also affect wheat production. And the increasing atmospheric CO2, which improves transpiration efficiency of plants, hadn't done very much to offset those losses, so it had prevented a further 4% decrease. But yeah, I guess the good news was that Australian farmers were making the best use of the limited resources they ever had. So there had been that technical improvement. It wasn't due to a declining investment in R&D. And this is probably a good news story, I think, but relative yield at latest calculation was still only about 58%. So if we think of economic yield generally being about 75 to 80% of water limited potential yield, there's still a large exploitable yield gap and plenty of room to move for Australian farmers to increase their wheat yield and meet that global demand, which is going to increase a lot over the next 20 years, starting from this year. Okay, so we'll have a little pause there, and then in the next section, we're going to dive in and have a bit of a closer look at what has delivered this unprecedented increase in relative yield that's occurred since 1990, and what implications might that have for future yield gains. So I'll break this down into genetic and management components, if you like. And genetic improvement has been a constant, steady increase over the entire period of Australian wheat production. So this is calculated from historic cultivar experiments. It's where you go and grab a bunch of historically popular wheat cultivars that have been grown over the decades, and you grow them all in a field in an experiment under modern management, and you see how they yield. And the increase in yield, if you plot it against year of release, is what you call genetic yield gain. And lots of these experiments have been done in Australia, and they're pretty uniformly shown that yield progress has been about 25 kilograms per hectare per year, or about 0.5% over the entire history of wheat production. And that's extremely standard compared to other wheat producing regions of the world. It's exactly what you'd expect. And that's happened through the transition from public to private breeding, which happened during the 1990s. There was worried that, well, there was a fear that privatisation would reduce genetic yield gain, but that doesn't seem to have happened. And it's also been done without a lot of the techniques for genetic improvement that have been available in other staples like maize, particularly, and rice. So there's no hybrids in Australian wheat production, very few anywhere in the world. They're all open pollinated. There's been no genetic modification in Australia, no gene editing as yet, but that may happen in the future. There has been a lot of marker-assisted selection. There's been some mutagenesis, and genomic selection is just starting to take effect. So probably the first cultivars that have been selected or partially selected using genomic selection will be hitting the shelves, hitting the paddocks in the next few years. That's the genetic side. What about management? So myself and some co-authors broke this down in a recent publication as to what we think has driven that rapid increase. And in my mind, it's a combination of things that have formed a coherent system. So the first thing, which this graph here shows, is that sowing times have got increasingly early, and that's been allowed through the invention of herbicides and the adoption of no-till cropping. So this is the change in sowing date over this period here of rapid yield increase. And I'll talk about this a bit more later on. The other thing is that there's been a large increase in break crops. So wheat yields more when it's grown after a broadleaf break crop like canola, which is what these black dots are, or chickpeas, which is what these square dots are. And you can see there's been a large increase in the area of those crops over that period. So wheat's yielding more because it's grown in rotation with break crops, which reduces root disease, weed burden, can increase nitrogen if it's a legume, and you get a reliable increase in yield. The other thing that has happened is the amount of nitrogen fertiliser that's been applied has also increased rapidly, and that's had a commensurate increase in crop yield. And something that we couldn't put on this graph, but has definitely played a factor, is the way that growers have been managing their summer fallows. So, as sort of mentioned, Australia has this Levantine climate with a hot summer and a cool, wet winter. But some rain does fall during the summer, and growers have started conserving that rain for use later in the season. And the way they've primarily done that is by spraying weeds, because weeds can use all the water, transpire all the water during the summer fallow. And they've also done it by retaining their stubble. So that's what this picture here is meant to represent, is a giant self-propelled sprayer killing all the summer fallow weeds in this paddock, which has got a good covering of stubble to improve infiltration and reduce evaporation. So better use of out-of-season water. And the genetics and all those management factors have synergies between them and have interacted to drive this increase in yield. And that's what I've tried to illustrate in this diagram here, sort of going through the cropping cycle. So where we have a previous crop. So if as a previous crop, we have a broadleaf break crop, we drive down root disease, we drive down weeds, we increase nitrogen, we increase water. And we have improved summer fallow weed control, which preserves those benefits and also builds more soil, water and nitrogen. Then through the ability to sow direct drill, so no-till farming, sow crops directly into the standing stubble, we can sow early and have higher water use and water use efficiency. And we're applying more nitrogen fertiliser, and we're growing these modern high-yielding semi-dwarf cultivars which respond to all of this, and that's what's delivered our yield gain for the last 30 or so years. Okay, so that's that story. I'm rapidly running myself out of time here. Being a professor, I'm prone to delivering protestations, so I'll try and finish this up quickly and have a quick look at prospects for future yield increases. And I'm going to focus on one. There's many, but I'm going to focus on adapting crop life cycle to increase yield. And as I mentioned previously, one of the ways, or the way, that wheat has been able to spread over such a huge range of environments in the world is that humans have become extremely effective at adapting wheat's life cycle duration to fit the environment it's grown in. And to understand why that's important, we're going back to agronomy school and the fact that yield is driven by grain number. So how many grains you have in a metre squared. It's not driven by the size of those grains. So there's a strong relationship between the number of grains and yield, and that's how wheat accommodates variation in the environment. Grain number is determined during what's known as the critical period, or critical period of yield determination. And every crop has one of these, and it usually is demarked by flowering. And in the case of cereal crops like wheat, it is the 30 days prior to flowering where grain number is determined. So wheat is most sensitive to stress in those 30 days because any stress will reduce grain number and thus reduce yield. And this sort of concept and how critical periods sit within the calendar year was very nicely distilled by a PhD student of mine called Bonnie Floor, who came up with this concept of optimal flowering periods. So describing the yield of a wheat crop relative to the time that it flowers in different environments. And this is an example of Kerrang in northern Victoria. And you can see that you have this real peak in yields depending on the timing. In this case, it's the middle of September. And that's because you're coinciding this critical period at a time of year that is most conducive to growth, where there's the least stress. When I say stress, I mean not too much drought. So you're coming out of the cool, wet winter. It hasn't got too hot. Frost is declining because that will sterilise wheat, and radiation is increasing. If you don't have enough radiation, you have got enough photosynthesis to drive growth and to drive grain number. So these are some pretty pics of some of these stresses starkly illustrated. This is a droughted crop up at Mildura. You can see there's not a lot of grains per metre squared coming off that. Contrast to that is frost. This is at Temora in southern New South Wales in 2014, very bad stem frost year. Low radiation. So this is a beautiful August day at Inverleigh in southwest Victoria with a wall of Antarctic ice heading over the field, but very low radiation, and crops that flowered at this time have very low yield. They're flowering too early, and this is an illustration of that from South Australia. This plot on the left here was sown too early, 20th of March, and you can see it hasn't accumulated enough biomass because it didn't have enough radiation during its critical period, compared to this one here sown on time on the 1st of May, which has more biomass, more spike weight and more grains and more grain yield. and heat is the final stress. Call these the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and sometimes more than one of the horsemen turn up at once. So this is drought and frost happening together in Loxton in South Australia. Okay, so the point of all that background is that adaptation of crop life cycle has been really important for wheat yield, Australian wheat yield, over the last century or more. So when Europeans first turned up in Australia, they brought with them UK winter wheats, which they couldn't sow until May because it didn't rain until April, and then they had to cultivate a lot for seed preparation and weed control. They'd be sown in June, and then they'd just flower too late. Their life cycle was too long because it was adapted to a northern European temperate environment with a cool and wet summer. And yields were low as a result, and wheat growing was constrained to places like Port Fairy or Goulburn, which are very cool and wet. So William Farrer, who my lectureship is named after, changed all that by crossing some Indian cultivars with the European winter wheat to produce a very successful cultivar called Federation, which Bonnie's standing next to a plot of here. And this allowed the wheat industry to expand to where it is today, inland of the Great Dividing Range. The phenology fit the Levantine seasonality. And for his efforts, William Farrer not only got to name my lectureship, but he also scored a position on the $2 bill, and greatest ever honour for an agricultural scientist, got a pub named after him in Wagga Wagga. So he's done well. So this is what Federation wheat did for the Australian wheat life cycle. It pulled it earlier into the year. Next change was a management one, and it was no-till farming. So the advent of herbicides let farmers sow crops directly without cultivating, and sowing times moved earlier. Sorry, I'm just having to whip through now. So that brought flowering dates closer to the optimum. Then we hit a bit of a wobble in the millennium drought period because we lost a lot of our autumn rainfall, which is what we need to establish crops in a timely fashion so that they flower at the right time. And there was a bunch of research sort of being done at the time on when we should be sowing, particularly if rainfall's declining. And the upshot of that, to cut a long story short, is that we needed to be sowing much earlier than we currently were. And there's a huge extension effort around that time to shift sowing times, and that really delivered the goods. So over that sort of 30, 40-year period, there's been a month shift in sowing date up to what farmers currently practice. And this, for the first time in history, has optimised our life cycle to our environment. So a bit of research that followed on from that myself and colleagues from CSIRO did was whether we could actually move our sowing time even earlier if we changed our genotype. So rather than using these fast spring wheats, which dominated production, what happens if we use winter wheat or slow spring wheat to allow earlier sowing and maybe even sow before this period of declining rainfall? And so we set up a bunch of experiments around Australia, sort of divided into mega environments, and we tested this using near isogenic lines. So they were genetically identical, but for their life cycle length, their development pattern. And what we found was that there was large potential for winter wheats, what we call fast winter wheats, to extend the sowing window. So this is sowing date relative to the optima for a fast spring. You can see that as you sow late, you start to lose a lot of yield, as was farmers' experience. And if you sow early with spring wheat, it starts to flower too early and you lose yield. But winter wheats were able to let yield be maintained or even slightly increased if you sowed early. And we sort of scaled this up nationally, and it would have a big benefit. So we're sort of doing this. We're spreading out the sowing window, but still achieving our optimal flowering period. The problem was at the time is that there was no cultivars that were fast winter wheats. They just hadn't been bred, but breeding companies started to produce them, and they did what we sort of predicted they would do in our experiments and simulations. So this is one of the first ones released, which was later named Longsword. And it did as we expected, and we're all excited about it. This is the first commercial planting near Swan Hill, but it failed to meet milling accreditation. So all of that kind of fell in a heap. But there is new hope, so I'm confident that this will hopefully deliver yield increases for Australian wheat in the near future, because most commercial programs are continuing to breed winter wheats, and a recently finished PhD student did some research around breeding, and some of his lines that he produced are very high yielding and being evaluated for release now. Okay, that's me done. This is the last slide. What will the future bring? Well, the last couple of years have been extremely good. Record production for wheat in Australia. This year's got off to a great start, so that bodes well. Climate change is going to continue to change everything, and crop life cycle is going to continue to be adapted. I think there's lots of opportunities to improve Australian wheat yield and meet our part of the challenge for food security for the next 3 decades. It's where the pinch is going to be. And I've got some more sort of ideas described in this chapter here, but lots of other people have lots of really good ideas, and hopefully students listening out there, young people will be having better ones as well. So that's where I'm going to pull up and open up for questions.
Thanks very much, James. That was fascinating, really giving us a good insight into a lot of areas there. There's certainly a lot of factors playing a major role in yield, that's for sure. We've got a few questions. Robin Warner was raising an issue around your thoughts on increasing production of pulses in Victoria, Australia. The majority of plant-based meat analogues seem to traditionally use imported plant proteins, especially soybeans. For example, V2 Foods plant burger is made from 70% imported soy protein. And I suppose she was interested in whether there's potential to grow research in this area.
Yeah, there's huge potential. This represents a massive opportunity for Australian wheat farmers, and there's sort of lots of combining factors. So the price of nitrogen fertiliser has tripled in the last year, so that really puts pressure on profitability of growing wheat and non-legume crops. And it'd be great if we could have more legumes in our farming systems, but there's only a limited market for legumes. So expanding markets like this with sort of novel protein products is a huge opportunity to get more grain legumes into our farming systems, which not only have benefits for the system and wheat yield and human health and greenhouse gas emissions and everything else. Huge potential.
Well, thanks very much, James. And Delhi, I'll just try the electronics here. I'm not sure if I can get it to work. Delhi, do you want to try and ask your question?
And yes, great talk, James. And well, before I ask a question, and I just want to use this opportunity, and even you are very modest, James. Really applied agronomy. You can publish in a high impact journal, natural climate change. So I think people working in a really practical field, you still can identify the issues, challenges, and publish in a high impact journal.
It's not easy, Delhi.
Yeah, I know, not easy, but we have. I
don't think I'll ever do it again.
Yeah, we have to have ambitions for that. My question is, James, is okay. The decline water limited yield. It could be partly due to the decline of soil organic matter. as you know, we discussed and we put together, grain farmer in Australia has been mining soil fertility, therefore nitrogen in particular, the organic matter. Therefore, that could have contributed, water holding capacity contributed to the yield decline.
Yeah, so the single biggest reason why growers currently aren't achieving economic or water limited yield is nitrogen deficiency. And that's for three reasons. You could say it's because they're not putting on enough nitrogen fertilizer, which is true. Or you could say it's because they're not growing enough legumes, which is also true. And partly it's because soil organic matter and its ability to mineralize nitrogen to become available to crops has declined. So those three factors have all operated, and nitrogen deficiency is really the low-hanging fruit. And I didn't mention it here, but it was certainly one of the ideas proposed in that chapter and ways to address that. And that's been the ongoing focus of research that I've been doing with collaborators for the last 4 years, and hopefully to be upscaled drastically in the near future.
Thank you.
James, Paul Dean has a question. I don't know if we can get him.
Oh, I can read it. Hi, James. With new technology and planting speed achieved the same as bringing in winter wheat varieties to allow earlier planting for fall crops.
Yeah.
Yes, that is absolutely true. So the reason why winter wheat cultivars are of benefit is that they allow sowing to start earlier, so programs can finish on time. Because if you think of the average serious operating Australian wheat farm, it's probably about 4,000 hectares, and about 2,000 of that is wheat. And obviously you can't sow all of that in one day. And that's where the real value of winter wheat lies, in letting you grower get more of their wheat flowering during the optimum period. And there's other ways of achieving that. And one way of achieving that is to sow really quickly. And in fact, on small farms or farms that are very have big investment in machinery to allow them to sow quickly, they don't really need winter wheat. So, yeah.
Thanks so much. Neil Young has a question regarding pathogens that we'd be keen to hear your opinion on. Neil? Neil?
Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Hi, great talk, James. I haven't looked for a while, but the top 10 listed pathogens in wheat production, parasites have been there in the past, and I'm a parasitologist, so I've kept an eye on that, and just wondering, are parasites on the radar for producers to improve yield, like better control of parasites?
By parasites, do you mean nematodes or?
Yes.
Yeah, they're a big issue. So the sort of root diseases that are bunched nematodes into, they're not really diseases, are they? But yeah, like root lesion nematodes are certainly an issue. Cereal cest nematode was a massive issue in Victoria and South Australia, but was largely overcome by host plant resistance. But yeah, they're a factor, and that's one of the reasons why wheat yields more after broadleaf crops, is because those crops don't necessarily host those nematodes.
Thanks very much, James. I think Bill Malcolm has a question as well. Bill?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
James, great talk. I love history, and I reckon history will tell us the truth about the future. So I love I just thought that was a fantastic presentation. And I also liked your description of agronomists who really have to know a lot about a lot, a bit like farm economists. And that's why farm economists and agronomists not only work together, they often end up being good mates. So well, welcome, James, to the university. My question, I've seen a bit about, breeding for drought tolerance and all that. And they have got, I know Monsanto and them have got them, but when they're in the good times, they tend not to yield much, is my understanding. So what is the story with, we're looking at breeding for yield, but what about the sort of the resistance to volatility?
Yeah, so there's been a few efforts at that, and people have tried to breed cultivars that yield well under drought, but as you say, they may not yield well under more favourable conditions. Therefore, they're not that profitable over many, many seasons. So, but I'm a bit of a, I guess I have a heretical views on this, like that you just breed for yield, like breed for high water use efficiency. And generally speaking, well, recent output from breeding programs would suggest that there are cultivars that are broadly adapted that yield very well under low yielding conditions and very well under high yielding conditions, and you're better off selecting those. So yeah, just breed for yield in your target environment and don't get too clever.
Yeah, I agree with that, because there's many other ways we can manage risk on a farm system.
Yeah, exactly. No, thanks for that question, Bill, and thanks for your welcome. And yeah, I agree where economists and agronomists tend to sort of be jacks of all trade, possibly masters of none, but yeah, you have a
Speak for yourself.
Oh, thanks so much, James. I think we might let you have lunch if you haven't had lunch already.
No.
And thank you on behalf of the faculty. I'd really like to thank you for an exceptionally clear and interesting presentation. It was really, really insightful for us, for those of us who really haven't sort of looked at these areas before. It was really, really great and informative. So thanks so much. Welcome to Melbourne. Wishing you all the very best for the future, and good luck with all the grant submissions and whatever to settle into Melbourne.
Thanks very much, Robin, and thanks everyone for coming and listening and asking good questions.
Thanks so much, James.